Today I am going to make some very simple oat sultana cookies. They're reasonably healthy. They do have some butter in them, but they don't have any sugar. They have maple syrup instead. So what I've done to start this is I've lined an oven tray with baking paper, and I have put 2.5 cups of just normal rolled oats and spread them out on the tray. I've used wholemeal, but you don't have to use wholemeal. That's just my preference. I've then put them into a hot oven at 170 degrees on fan bake, and I have baked them for 10 minutes. I've just taken them out of the oven, so they're still quite hot. Now, while they've been sitting in the oven, I have also melted 125 grams of butter and 1/3 of a cup of maple syrup. And I've just melted that on the stove. And the reason I've done that while the oats are in the oven is because it allows it to cool down a little bit, because we need to put an egg in there shortly. And of course, if it's too hot, the egg will cook, which we don't want it to do. Now, in this pan here, I have 2/3 of a cup of wholemeal flour, and I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of baking powder. I'm just going to put that in and give it a bit of a mix. Just to mix it in. And I also have 1 cup of sultanas. Just normal everyday sultanas. If you don't have sultanas, you could use any other dried fruit, really. You could chop up some apricots, you could use goji berries, you could use whatever you want. But we like sultanas in our cookies. So I just give them a little bit of a mix around. Sometimes the sultanas stick together, so I just like to separate them a little bit in the flour. Like so. And we come back to our butter and maple syrup, and I have 1 egg. It's a size 7. Doesn't really matter if it's a 6, but this one's a size 7. I've broken it into a little dish, and I am just going to mix it with a fork just to beat it a bit. You can do it in a bigger dish with a whisk if you prefer. But I'm just going to do it with a fork. Give it a pretty good mix around. And that's pretty much beaten enough, really. You don't have to whisk it with a machine or anything. Okay, now to add that in, that's when I do need my whisk. Because this butter is still warm, you really have to be whisking quite well when you put the egg in again, so it doesn't cook. So give it a bit of a whisk, and then slowly tip the egg in, but whisk it really well, because you don't want it to cook. And you'll end up with a nice buttery mixture. There's no cooked egg sitting in there at all. I've whisked that up really well. Right. Now back to my oats. I'm now just going to take them off my paper and put them into my flour mixture. Fairly easy. It's why I use the baking paper on the tray. Makes it all very simple. I'm going to push it into the middle. Grab the ends, lift it up, and tip it in with the flour and berries. And you put the paper back on the tray, because that's what we're going to cook the cookies on anyway. So back with our spoon, mix the oats in. Make sure the flour's all nice and mixed in. And then our butter and maple syrup and egg is just going to go all in there as well. Make sure we get it all. And a spatula is good for that. And then we're just going to give it a really good mix. And even if you think it's mixed in, just give it a bit more to make sure that you don't really want to see any flour once it's all mixed in. There's no rush. It doesn't need to be a hot mix or anything. You just need to make sure it's mixed in well. course, you're going to see the oats and the sultanas, but you shouldn't see any big bits of flour. See, I've got one there, so clearly that's not mixed in enough yet. So making sure I flick it from underneath, getting it all. And we've got a nice sticky mixture. Now I'm going to head over to the sink and we're going to roll them into balls. Now this mixture is enough to do 2 trays. And the best way to do it, I find, is with wet hands. So just cold water, run your hands under the tap, give it a bit of a shake. Take a bunch, a decent sized tablespoon, roll it into a ball. Now you're not going to get a perfect ball, but just about there. And I can feel already that it's starting to get sticky and gluggy. In fact, it's not sticking together well enough. It means my hands are not wet enough. The water will help stick it together. See that? Now that's gone into a ball. Much better. Decent space apart because we're going to flatten them as well. You can usually get 2 or 3 before you have to run your fingers under the water again. Looks like I'm only going to get 2 because it's quite sticky. Do lose a bit in the sink, but it's nothing to worry about. It's not really a lot. It's not going to make a whole lot less biscuits. Squash them together. Now, rather than do the whole lot, I'm just going to show you what I do from there. So I'm just going to put this aside and wash my hands. Put this aside for a minute. I'll come back and do the rest. Now, I have a little bit of water, cold water again, just plain cold water. And I find the easiest way is a soup spoon. Dip it in the water and push down, and use your fingers as well. Don't have to be perfectly round, just reasonably flat, but also stuck together. If you feel like they're pulling apart, push them together. So there's one. I'll just do the next one, which also shows you. The spoon just helps to keep it aligned, I reckon, from what I feel. And you want the ball about that size. They're not going to rise a lot in the oven, so they're not going to spread out much more than that. So the size you get on here is the size you're going to end up with. So it's really up to you. I don't want to make them any bigger than that because realistically, although they're yummy, a big biscuit is in this case would just be too much. Better to have 2 if you want, rather than one really large one. So I'm going to carry on and finish them off and cook them, and then I'll come back and show you what they're like when they come out of the oven. Okay, I have just taken these out of the oven. I baked them just like I did the rolled oats at the beginning. I left the oven on 170, fan bake, and I've baked them for 15 minutes. Now, ovens vary, so it could be anything between 12 and 20 minutes. But what you're looking for is a golden brown, pretty much around the edges. You don't want them any darker than that. You can see there's a bit of gold in there. And I've left them on the trays for about 5 or 6 minutes, just for them to be able to harden up a little on the bottom. Leaving them on the trays first helps with that before you take them off and put them on a cooling rack. And you may also notice that the first ones I did, that I showed you, that I rolled into balls and flattened, are a little bit smaller. I did end up making the others a bit bigger, but it's purely up to you. That's probably a good child size, and these are a good adult size. Another tip as well, when I rolled the rest of the balls, now normally when I make them, I roll the whole 2 trays of balls and then I flatten them. But as I showed you, or wanted to show you how I flatten them, I pretty much rolled a few balls and flattened them straight away. However, when I rolled the rest of the balls and I left them, like by the time I got to the last one that I rolled, the rest had been sitting, of course, waiting, and that actually made them easier to flatten. So if you find that flattening them is a bit tricky and a bit sticky and they won't stick together, just leave them for a minute or 2 and it will probably be a lot easier to flatten them. The main thing you're trying to do is if when you flatten them, they spread apart and they don't stick together, push them back together. They need to be stuck together because otherwise, when they're baked, they will be very crumbly and will just fall apart. So basically, you can take it off with a spatula, but baking paper is pretty good. And like I say, I've left them for a couple of minutes, 5 or 6 minutes, so they're actually easy to take off and put on my cooling rack. And that's it, done. They don't last very long in our house. I like to store them in a cookie jar. You don't have to put them into a sealed, airtight container. Doesn't seem to make that much difference. And like I say, they don't really last that long in our house. So I don't worry. I just put them in the cookie jar and leave them on the bench. Of course, it might be different if you have young children around. You may not want them to know they're there. But that's my my version of rolled oats biscuits that are reasonably healthy. Like I say, they've got butter in them and they do have 1 egg. There is no sugar. Of course, maple syrup takes over that. And the maple syrup, nothing smells nicer than cooked maple syrup. I mean, I could smell them cooking in the oven when I was in the lounge. So it's really nice and it adds to the flavour. So that's it. There you go.